Even with my short tenure as a reviewer on the tube, this is easily the hardest game I've ever had to talk about, and not in the ways that you'd probably expect. And before you say anything, yes, I do realize that up until this point, I've only fully spoken about one game. I might be slow, but I'm not entirely stupid. Anyways, as I was saying, this game is difficult to talk about not because it's some masterpiece that I have nothing to criticize it on, and not because the game was so abhorrently bad that it doesn't deserve to be talked about at all, but because it lies so deeply in the middle. Now, before any Death's Door's defenders find this video and attempt to virtually castrate me in the comments, I'm not saying the game as a whole is mediocre. Okay, well, that's exactly what I just said, but it's not what I meant. The game as a whole is not mediocre. Quite the opposite. It's just that the game doesn't stand out in any of the typical ways that make or break a game for me. The story is decent enough to keep my interest throughout playing, but not decent enough for me to care about any character or anything that's really going on. And the combat, while enjoyable at times, doesn't do anything that reinvents the wheel. Where the game does shine in is its level design, exploration, and music, which the latter is usually something that I don't really consider when reviewing a game. Basically, to make a long spiel less long, Death's Door is a game that is greater than the sum of its parts. And it was those elements that led me to fall in love not only with the world, but with the game as a whole. Death's Door is a 3D isometric action-adventure Zelda Souls-like, which is not only a mouthful to say, but if you didn't catch my sarcasm when saying that, I have a bit of a problem with the game being identified as a Zelda Souls-like. The Zelda part, I'm gonna let be, because I've never played a Zelda game. Yeah, I know, bite me. But the Souls-like part is what I have an issue with, because this game is not a Souls-like. Quick gaming lesson with Procrastinator. Games that are considered to be a Souls-like usually have these few defining mechanics: a checkpoint system, a stamina management system, a system where you lose all your upgrade and purchase materials upon death, a huge emphasis on difficulty, usually in enemy and level design, and of course, the insane boss battles. Now, having said all that, Death's Door doesn't have many of these systems or features. While there is a checkpoint system in the game in the form of the doors that serve as a respawn point upon death, as well as a fast travel system between the Reaping Commission headquarters, your hub world, and the levels that you explore, there's no stamina bar, you don't lose anything upon death, except maybe brain cells, but we'll get into that later. And while the game is difficult at points, it's nowhere near as difficult as most Souls-like can be. And as for bosses, well, we'll get into that after the story, since there isn't honestly much to talk about. In Death's Door, you play as one of Death's Reapers, immortal crows who are tasked with reaping the souls of beings that are past their due date. You play as one of these crows, and since the game doesn't bother to give him a name, I decided to name him Edgar, just for simplicity's sake, and if you know anything about poetry, you'll know why I named him Edgar. While on a mission to reap one of these souls, Edgar gets knocked out and is assigned soul stolen by Greycrow, an old reaper who gives his assigned soul to a mysterious door known as Death's Door, which is a problem because while reapers' assigned doors are open, they become mortal. Greycrow informs Edgar that his and Edgar's assigned souls are both behind this door, and the only way to get them is to open the door by getting 3 giant souls. Since Greycrow is an old fart who can't fight anymore, more on that later, he basically strong-arms Edgar into reaping the 3 giant souls for him to open the door. This is Edgar's main goal, to reap the 3 giant souls and open the door, and unless you have the IQ of a connoisseur of fine paints, you quickly realize that there is clearly some deeper issues with not only the world, but with the system enforced and constructed by the Reaping Commission and its leader, the Lord of Doors. Through the souls of dead reapers used to open special doors and the journals of reapers that are found behind them, you learn that an order was given from the Lord of Doors to permanently lock the doors of the 3 giant souls, stranding and leaving the reapers on those missions for dead. Hell, some of the bosses outright say that they're benefiting from the system that the Commission created, so when the game tries to act like it's some sort of surprise that the central antagonist is actually the Lord of Doors, it honestly confuses me as to why we lay the story out like this. Not that it's an entirely bad thing. I think the game did a decent job of slowly revealing the plot in a way that keeps you somewhat intrigued. It just feels like the game forgot it was doing it. After collecting the 3 giant souls and opening Death's Door, you learn that behind Death's Door is actually Death, who was trapped there by the current Lord of Doors after he broke the terms of a long-standing deal made by Death and the first Lord of Doors. Since Death was getting tired and depressed of, well, killing people all day and carrying their souls to the afterlife, the first Lord of Doors set up Death's Door to automatically collect the souls of reaped individuals, and to keep Death from reaping the souls himself, enlisted the help of the crows to go out and reap the souls for him, in exchange for prolonged life. This system worked for years, until the current Lord of Doors locked Death behind Death's Door, possibly with the help of the Urn, which it's not too clear, to essentially make himself and a few others immortal. After hearing this, Greycrow flips the fuck out due to his fear of death and attacks you, which I found kinda hilarious because at the beginning of the game he states that he's too old and slow to fight, but by the way he was putting the paws, or I guess feathers, on Edgar, I think he would have been just fine. After defeating Greycrow, you then go back to the Commission, telling the rest of the crows the truth, freeing them, and then heading out to face the Lord of Doors. You also learn about a society of free crows and how Edgar might be the crow foretold by destiny, but we'll get into that part later. The reason I decided to go through the story first is because, in my opinion, it was the weakest part of the game, and if it felt like I was just running through listing story events, it's because I was, and honestly, that's how it felt going through the story. It felt as if I was just going through a checklist rather than experiencing a story, and I think I know why. Throughout the game, there's very few moments that pertain to the overall plot of opening Death's Door. There's one at the beginning, obviously, to explain your main goal, but after that, the next story event that actually pushes the plot forward doesn't appear until about 3/4 of the way through the game. So yeah, the plot's kinda weak, but where the game does excel is in its character and world building. Now I know what you might be thinking. Procrastinator, how can the characters and world building be good and the story not? Well, let me tell you, young Padawan, it's because most of the interesting characters and world building don't have fuck all to do with the plot. And even though that is the case, the game does a great job of having the side characters of the game completely steal the show. From Pothead and his unwavering determination to save his grandmother, the Urn Witch's soul, and put her to rest, to Barb the Bard in her quest to write the best piece of music, and Jefferson the Squid and his knowledge of the many hidden secrets around the land as well as his delicious soup, to even the Frog King whose quips and jokes had me unironically laughing out loud. Having these character goals and interactions that are separate from the main plot makes it feel as if the world is alive, so much so that I was more invested in exploring and helping the characters out than I was in actually completing the story. Speaking of exploring, this is probably as good a time as any to finally talk about gameplay, which is broken into 3 key parts: exploration, puzzles, and combat. Let's start out with exploration because I'd say it's the largest part of Death's Door's gameplay, and luckily it's pretty fucking good. The locations in Death's Door are not only vibrant and intricately designed, but they are packed full of items, collectibles, and upgrades for you to find, so much so that I wouldn't be surprised if some people find it daunting. The game encourages you to, well, explore by not having any waypoints or map markers. Hell, the game doesn't even give you a map to look at, and while Greycrow does point you in the general direction of the main areas where the 3 giant souls reside, and Jefferson gives you the general direction to look for character upgrades, there's nothing else in the game telling you where to go. Fortunately, the areas in the game are well crafted with a good general flow, so you never end up getting too lost. I generally like when games do this because it respects my intelligence and doesn't treat me like I'm some autistic child that will get lost if mommy and daddy don't hold my hand and tell me exactly what to do and when to do it. The only slight problem with it in Death's Door is that some of the items in the game are so fucking well hidden that you'll miss them entirely. For example, the health and magic upgrades are so well hidden that I was only able to find a handful myself by just naturally exploring the world. For the rest, I had to look up a guide on YouTube. Yeah, fucking bite me. I almost feel as if the developers were expecting you to look up where to find some of these upgrades with the way they hid some of them. But other than a few exceptions, a keen eye could easily find most, if not all, of Death's Door's secrets. Another thing that in my opinion definitely helps with exploring in Death's Door is surprisingly the music, which is a bit strange for me as I typically don't pay too much attention to the music that's being played in the background. But Death's Door's music was so beautiful that I would often stop what I was doing just to listen. I mean, here, listen for yourself. A pretty decent segue into the game's puzzles since a few of the collectibles can only be found after completing one, and much like a Radiohead song, their quality is very inconsistent. You could go from a puzzle that requires 5D chess level intellect and pattern recognition to a puzzle that can be completed by a lobotomite. Luckily, I'm just being overdramatic and most of the puzzles fall somewhere in the middle. However, for some of the 5D level puzzles, I often found them not to be difficult due to the mechanics of the puzzle, but due to the complete lack of any pattern or direction to follow. For example, there's one puzzle in the Urn Witch's estate that requires you to break these vases in a certain order to open up a secret room, and I couldn't find any hint or pattern, so again I went to YouTube. Now I know I can be a total brainlet sometimes, but a man can only stare at something and be utterly confused for so long before he gives up. But again, this issue is only in a few of the puzzles, and puzzles aren't that big of a piece of the gameplay that it completely ruins it or anything, and I can't find a good way to segue into it, but let's finally talk about combat. Combat in Death's Door is pretty simple. You have a light attack, a charge heavy attack, and a magic attack whose only purpose is to provide you with some type of range option. And that's basically it. Other than a roll attack and a ground pound attack, your melee options don't really change much. Okay, I mean that's technically a lie because changing the weapon that Edgar uses does impact the range of your attacks, the damage, and the number of swings you can do consecutively, but I wouldn't say that changes your overall approach to combat. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What about the magic? Doesn't that change how you approach combat? And to that, I would say, kinda? Not really. As I just said, magic's main use is to give you some type of range option, so that's what most of the magic falls into. But I mean, there is a bit of a difference between each type of magic. The arrow ability is your quick shot ability, making it the easiest one to combo in between your melee attacks. The bomb ability is your hardest hitting and slowest magic attack, making it best useful for big damage or against enemies with long windups. The hook shot is the only magic ability that is not a projectile and instead yeets you into melee distance. Last and certainly least would be the flame ability, which applies a lingering burning effect on enemies, making it your best and only way to damage an enemy without focusing them. Although I do struggle saying that this is the main use of the flame ability, since for it to even apply the lingering burning effect, you have to first upgrade it by fighting a mini-boss, which I didn't find till towards the end of my playthrough, which led me not to rely on it. But hey, that's probably a skill issue on my part, since you could definitely find the upgrade sooner since it's the first magic ability that you have to unlock, so I won't fault the game for that. But yeah, combat in Death's Door is pretty basic, and the enemies by themselves aren't doing the game any favors. Most enemies in Death's Door by themselves are pretty easy to beat. I mean, for one, there aren't that many of them, two, most of them can be beaten in a couple of hits, and they don't have any complex mechanics that require you to study and learn them. However, that doesn't make the game easy. Quite the opposite. In fact, Death's Door is actually a pretty difficult game. Nowhere near Souls-like difficult, but difficult nonetheless. The game achieves this by having this beautiful mix of all three of the core parts of gameplay, while also packing the level full of enemies, not in a way that feels cheap, but in a way that basically feels as if the game is testing you in all of the core gameplay elements. I can't find another way to explain it other than these parts where you're making your way to one of the three giant souls that just have a beautiful flow between combat, exploration, and puzzle solving, and it was this beautiful amalgamation that elevated combat to be better than the sum of its parts. But I still can't say it's perfect because unfortunately this game controls like a coat hanger abortion. Now you might be wondering what I mean by that, and the best way that I can describe it is by saying that controlling Edgar just feels floaty. Not only did simply moving around feel like Edgar was just constantly trying to walk on ice, but it also felt floaty in combat, and it best shows while trying to use any of the magic abilities. Since the game doesn't have a hard lock-on system, it requires you to rely on this soft lock-on that will kinda snap onto targets. I say kinda because sometimes, although it feels as if you've locked onto a target, the fact that my projectile will fly right past them says fucking otherwise. Which is annoying because you have a limited number of magic charges that once depleted have to be recharged by using a melee attack. This issue also rears its stupid head in exploration and puzzles for the same reason of missing what you're actually trying to hit, which is frustrating because I feel as if this issue could have been avoided by A, having an arrow that showed up under Edgar as he was aiming, or B, by just giving him a reticle when he aims. But hey, what do I know? Other than that, Death's Door's combat was enjoyable, even with its floatiness and lack of any real complex enemies. But luckily that latter issue didn't have any impact on boss fights. Death's Door doesn't have many bosses. The number is about 13, which you may think is a lot until you realize that only 6 of them are main bosses, 6 of them are mini bosses, and one of them, well, we'll get into that a bit later. And although Death's Door may lack in quantity of bosses, it definitely makes up in quality. First, let's start with the mini bosses because although I just praised the game for the quality of the bosses, the mini bosses are where I think they fell a bit short. Not saying they're terrible, it's just that the game has a little bit of a problem on the diversity front when it comes to them. Over half of the mini-bosses are just reskinned guardians whom you have to fight to upgrade your magic ability, which is only like 4, but still. Anyway, that in itself isn't bad since they're technically optional, but since they're pretty well hidden and could be completely passed over if not looking hard enough, it's kind of upsetting to me that you have to go through all this trouble just to fight the same reskinned enemy. However, where they lack in visual variety, they make up for in mechanical variety. Although they all share the same basic moveset, each Guardian has a special ability tied to the magic upgrade they're guarding. The Flame Guardian has a flying flame orb protecting him, the Bomb Guardian has a bunch of tracking bombs that he fires, and yeah, you get the gist. The other half of the mini-bosses are okay, but there's nothing really interesting to talk about since there's only like 2 of them. But the main bosses are where things get a lot more interesting. Each boss is intricately designed to incorporate their lore and backstory into their moveset, and if you've seen my Kenna review, then you should know how much I love that shit. The Urn Witch will create pots to attack you with. The Frog King not only has his armor that you have to tear off, but also uses a club that reverts the area to its original state, much like the pillars on the way to the boss room. And Grey Crow, since he's an older Reaper, uses much of the same abilities Edgar gets during the game. Not only that, but the difficulty on most of these bosses are perfect. None are too hard to the point that makes you want to kill yourself, but they aren't so easy to make you feel as if it was a cakewalk either. Well, all except for Betty and Grey Crow and the final boss, the Lord of Doors. Betty and Grey Crow were a problem because a lot of their attacks just involved them flailing around, which made it hard to determine what could damage me and what was them just moving around. The Lord of Doors is difficult because 1, he's the final boss, and 2, because he has 2 phases. The first phase involves a chase scene where Edgar hunts the Lord of Doors through all the areas that he's been to before, and while in each area, the Lord of Doors gains an ability from each of the giant souls that were in the area. So, the Urn Witch's explosive pots, the Frog King's bounce attack, and Betty's roll attack. This all accumulates into a final showdown at the commission's office that requires you to remember the ways you countered the 3 bosses before, as well as counter the Lord's original moves as well. This was a very satisfying final boss, although I think it could have done a better job at encouraging you to use all the magic that you've acquired, but that's just me being picky. After defeating the Lord of Doors, you free Death and put the world back into a state of balance, where all the characters that you meet can live happily ever after. The end. Only, it isn't. Well, it kinda is. Let me explain. Upon defeating the Lord of Doors and seeing what happens to most of the characters, towards the end you see the Gravedigger, a reappearing character who is immortal and who gives the last rites to most of the bosses in the game, dragging the lifeless corpse to the Lord of Doors. And while doing that, you see a key fall off the Lord's body. Now when I first saw this, I thought this was going to be used to find a weapon or magic that could be used to kill the Gravedigger, since that was his request when you first meet him. Basically, I thought it was going to be a secret boss fight, but oh boy was I wrong. It actually was the start of unlocking the true ending of the game, which is something that I don't usually do, but by the time I figured out I was working towards the true ending, I was too deep into it and I just said fuck it. Now you might be wondering how exactly you unlock this true ending. Well, it's simple. You just have to find 7 tablets of truth. And to do that, all you really have to do is collect the bell tower key that the Lord of Doors dropped, use it to gain the access to the bell tower to make it night, find all 7 ghosts that are floating around the lost cemetery area and put them into their rock home thing. Then find all 3 of the owls that are scattered across each of the areas the 3 giant souls were in. Then go back to the overgrown rooms to find and defeat an avarice chest, which is basically just a combat arena. After that, you have to go back to the stranded sailor and take Jefferson to the Frog King's domain. And oh, did I forget to mention that for this step you can't use the doors to fast travel there, so you have to walk all the way over, which took about 10 minutes. After taking him to the Frog King's domain, you need to follow the path shown by the moon to allow Jefferson to speak with the spirits of the deep. You then have to light 6 braziers back at the old watchtower near where Betty used to be. There, I think you also find a locket that's important to the Gravedigger, but I can't definitively remember where this step was, and again, bite me, because I didn't even want to do all this shit in the first place. Then, and only then, can you finally fight the Gravedigger, which, if you can recall, was the only reason I was doing this shit in the first place. But oh, don't look so relieved, motherfucker, because we're still nowhere close to being done. That is because, for me, the final task to get the last tablet was to go find and plant all life seeds in the healing pots, which is something I didn't really touch on, but to make this short, it's the resource used to heal Edgar throughout the game. But yeah, you have to find and plant all 50 of them, which you might be saying shouldn't be that hard if you explored carefully. However, my response to that would be fuck that, because if you miss just one of them, you have to search every nook and cranny of each level to find them. Then, and only then, can you go to the Free Crow Society and finally view the true ending. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Yeah, Procrastinator, that was a lot, but none of that seems too difficult. And my response to that would be, you're wrong, because just like I said earlier, there's no explanation or direction that is given to you, the player, on how to find or do any of this. The game just kinda expects you to figure this shit out, or look it up on the internet like I did. Yeah, again, fuck off. Anyway, the secret ending not only gives you an explanation on how the world got into the situation it's in now, but also gives out some important world building, but since we've been here for forever, I'm just gonna give the abridged version. So basically, centuries ago, a human found the first door that held truth and opened it. Upon opening it, the two were joined together, but by doing so, his soul was lost in the process. They then returned to the mortal realm, but by doing that, caused the first door to be destroyed and caused truth to be trapped in the ruins. The Lord of Doors then used some of the remains of the first door to trap death behind death's door, placing the world in a state of stagnation. Then the Lord of Doors and the Commission would assign Grey Crow to reap the soul of the human who fused with truth, but since their soul was already lost, he can never find it, which is dumb, but we'll get into that bit later. However, since the first door remains were where the Free Crows made their hideout, truth would give them the knowledge and the tools they needed to free the world from its stagnation through the foretold crow, Edgar. And after finding all the tablets of truth, Edgar would absorb truth and be tasked with spreading it to the mortal realm. And the game ends off with Edgar doing just that, flying off into the distance, which is an ability that would have been very fucking useful to have. Now I could probably tear into the ending and talk about all my issues with it, like why the Lord of Doors would send Grey Crow to reap the soul of the human who merged with the door, but I'm not going to since you have to go out of your way to get this ending. However, I ultimately think this ending is a bit weak due to the fact that a lot of it came out of nowhere and it doesn't feel like it was built up to. Like Edgar being some crow of prophecy, why was that never brought up by any of the Free Crows beforehand? But like I said earlier, this game is greater than the sum of its parts. Although the story was a bit weak and the combat was a bit simplistic at times, it's how the game weaves us in with some of its stronger elements like exploration, puzzles, characters, and music, which elevates it up past some of its shortcomings, changing it from what would have been a very average and forgettable game to a game that was thoroughly enjoyable and one that is bound to leave a lasting impact on anyone who plays it.